Morning, good afternoon, good evening. I've spoken about democracy. I will return to that theme again today. Zimbabwe is a failed state. And one of the reasons why we are a failed state is for the last 44 years, we've failed to hold free, fair, and credible elections. How did we get here? Well, I think Zimbabwe had the great misfortune of having, for the last 44 years, buffoons for leaders. That is the bottom line. Here is Tony Blair talking about why Singapore has been a great success since that nation's foundation.
The fascinating thing about Lee Kuan Yew is he took three important decisions right at the beginning for Singapore. Each one of them now seems obvious. Each one at the time was deeply contested. Number one, he said, everyone's going to speak English in Singapore. Now, there were lots of people who said to him at the time, no, we need to have our own local language. We need to be true to our roots and everything. He said, no, English is the language of the world and we're all going to speak English. Secondly, he said, we're going to get the best intellectual capital from wherever it exists in the world and we're going to bring it to Singapore. And again, people said, no, we should stand on our own 2 feet. And you're also bringing in the British, who we've got all these disputes with. And he said, no, I'm going to bring in the best from wherever they are, and they're going to come to Singapore. And the third thing he did was he said there's going to be no corruption. And one of the ways we're going to do that is we're going to make sure our political leaders are well paid, which the Singapore leaders are the best paid in the world. And there's going to be zero tolerance of corruption. Those are the three decisions that were instrumental in building Singapore today.
The truth be told, Singapore's success is just a repeat of what the ancient Greeks did. I've on the screen there, Pericles. He is considered by many to be the founder of democracy in Athens, at least one of the fathers who made democracy a success in ancient Greece. And thus launching what many would accept as the golden age of Athens. What they were doing in Singapore is not different from what he did nearly those 2,500 years ago. He decided, together with the other Greek leaders, that they were going to encourage freedom of expression, free media, freedom of expression, freedom, and encourage the best ideas, people with the best ideas to come into Athens and build that nation. And what we now consider to be democracy, the rule of the people, by the people, for the people, these guys were the founding fathers of it, the Greeks. That open-mindedness, that willingness to accept ideas, to nurture them, is what made Greece a success, is what made Singapore a success. Ironically, in Zimbabwe, when we gained our independence in 1980, Robert Mugabe did not surround himself with men and women of great ideas. He surrounded himself were some of the pathetic individuals, shallow-minded individuals who had no clue what they're talking about. You look at people like Simon Muzenda, Joyce Mujuru, Emerson Mnangagwa. The list goes on and on and on. He elected these people for no other reason other than that they will be doggedly faithful to him. And in their presence, he will look the genius. I mean, even ZANU-PF at the time, they had quality leaders. People like Edison Robho, he was articulate. He had many interesting ideas. Some of them, one may not agree with them, but at least he had his own original ideas. Whereas if you compare him with the likes of Simon Msenda, you realize this is just a nation heading for disaster. I'm not saying that there were not many Zimbabweans of ideas around Mugabe. There were. But one of the things that he was doing was appointing those people for the purposes of window dressing. People like Bernard Chizero, it is no secret that he was a great thinker in his own right, very competent. When he was appointed Minister of Finance, he is on record challenging some of Mugabe's ideas, particularly the bloated army. It didn't make any economic sense to have a bloated army, bloated police, bloated CIO, and so forth, civil service, and so forth. It didn't make any idea. It didn't make any sense at all. Bernard Chizero challenged that. But of course, Mugabe overruled him. Some of the ideas that he was pursuing was for political reasons, of course. But Bernard Chizero realized this was just heading for disaster. One of the things that Mugabe did soon after he got into power was to pay those around him very well indeed. But it was not to encourage or reward them for their competence. Rather, the opposite. He was buying their silence. Robert Mugabe's cabinet is renowned for being one of the most useless, to say the very least, cabinets. Mugabe bribed his cabinet members so that they would become yes men. They'll never challenge what he said. They were, after all, being well rewarded for their silence. And so you end up with a situation where even at the peak of the Kukura-Wundi massacre, which anybody with any brain at all would have been questioning what the hell is going on here. One of the most amazing things is that there was deafening silence in his cabinet. I just listened to Simba Makoni explaining how Mugabe launched, he's started bribing those around him.
I recall very clearly that when we came into office in 1980, we inherited Ian Smith's systems. And Ian Smith's ministers drove Peugeot 504s. They drove themselves from home to work in their Land Rovers and all in kinds. Most of them were farmers. They parked their Land Rover and then they used the government vehicle when they were at work with a chauffeur. When they finished at night, they packed them and they took theirs to go home. Within the month of our coming into office, Prime Minister Mugabe then directed that every minister be issued with an E-class Mercedes-Benz. And the Peugeot 504s were retired to permanent secretaries, and the deputy ministers then took over. We can also look at many other things, small they may appear at the time. Let me hazard that even at that point, Enos Nkala was our Minister of Finance. I don't think we knew what budget we inherited from Ian Smith when the decision was taken to buy those E-class fleets for the ministers. So the material affection for material things has always been with us. And the differentiation also, even going back into the camps, Zemashefu, Neze, my comrades, Makada, were not the same. So much so that even today, when the so-called Minister for Presidential Affairs or Provincial Governor, as they were, goes to Bubi or Binga, they will be served separately and differently from the other people. The avarice grew as we began to exploit the opportunities of office. When I was in the government, the minister was allocated one vehicle that they kept, which was the sedan they used in town. If you needed to go off-road, then your ministry hired off-road vehicles from the CMED, and you were charged for it. Now a minister will have an average of 4 vehicles in his forecourt, all at government's expense.
So the leadership modeled the wrong kind of behavior, and that kind of behavior permeated all across our society. Our CEOs, like you're saying, heads of parastatals and so forth, modeled from the top.
Indeed. Indeed.
Well, we can we cannot deny that. That has become the norm in Zimbabwe. And Mugabe was to do this to the same effect during the GNU of 2008 to 2013. He bribed Morgan Tsvangirai and his MDC friends with the trappings of high office, the E-class Mercedes-Benz, the very generous salaries and allowances, and for Morgan Tsvangirai himself, the $4 million mansion in Highlands. And he bought their silence. This has undermined our hope of really creating a democratic nation. It's not peculiar to Zimbabwe alone. In fact, it's a common feature in all of Africa. The problem of bad governance. I've got there a map of Africa, and it shows democracy index. And countries like South Africa and Botswana and Ghana to some extent, are the ones that are scoring a bit better, a lot better actually, 7 point something. Others much lower. And we in Zimbabwe, we are looking at 0.2, 2 point something. This has been the underlying problem with our country. We do not have a healthy and functioning democratic system. And it shows. Last year, we had elections. And even SADC and the continental body, AU, condemned those elections as flawed and illegal. It's disappointing that 44 years after independence, we are still failing to hold free, fair, and credible elections. Our economy, or the economic meltdown in Zimbabwe, is because we failed to have a competent, accountable government. That is the bottom line. Africa is considered the dark continent because it is the one continent where bad governance has been the norm. It's no secret at all that those countries, even in our own SADC region, countries like Botswana that have had consistently free, fair, and credible elections, their economy is doing well. South Africa, since 1994, they have consistently held free, fair, and credible elections. Although the last 30 years they've had some serious problems and challenges, at least they've not had the meltdown that we've seen in countries like Zimbabwe. Namibia is not too bad. They're not scoring very highly. There is 6.52. And the economy also is showing it's not too bad. Countries that have failed to perform, to hold free, fair, and credible elections, it doesn't matter how wealthy you are. You will always consistently perform way below par. Countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, ever since that country gained its independence, has had launched from one crisis to another. And its vast wealth is becoming scarce, just like Zimbabwe. Instead of it becoming a blessing, it's become a curse. We cannot deny that the vast wealth in Zimbabwe has become a curse. Mnangagwa was able to bankroll last year's elections, his vote rigging machinery. It is many people believe you must have spent at least $5 billion US from bribing, from buying Povo chicken and chips to attend the SANU-PF rallies, passed in from all over the country, to buying chiefs, church leaders, twin cab cars, right up to the judges, US $400,000 They were paid. All of them, all the judges. None of them turned the offer down. Ministers, $500,000 each. And our friends, the MPs, senators, $40,000 that were paid in November 2022. All for one purpose: to bribe them. Until we improve our governance issue, Zimbabwe is not going to recover. That is a fundamental truth. That is a fundamental reality that we cannot deny. We are kidding ourselves. Right now, we are looking at a situation where ZANU-PF is already gearing for 2028 elections. And the party has not implemented any reforms. There's no chance of implementing any meaningful reforms, regardless of the SADC and the AU reports that say those last year's elections were flawed. The opposition itself will no doubt regroup, and Chamisa and company will come back with the same ridiculous, pathetic promise that is going to win big because I have plugged all the vote-rigging loopholes. I think many people have said, and there is some truth in that the opposition in Zimbabwe has become ZANU-PF Team B. They are playing for ZANU-PF Team A to win and to have political legitimacy. And as long as they can persuade Zimbabweans to participate in the flawed elections as they did last year, SADC will find it very difficult to deny them legitimacy. Zimbabwe is a failed state, and we have the misfortune of being governed by buffoons. We didn't have the visionary leaders, the visionary approach of leaders to appreciate the importance of giving the people a meaningful say in the governance of the country. That should be the challenge that we should be focusing our minds on. Until we get restore that power, I don't think Zimbabwe will ever change. Before I close, I'll just show some comments from one of the listeners out there. Well, Demba is saying, which failed state, when you are people who are keeping the regime in power? Well, I don't know how I'm keeping the regime in power. I said here and I'll say it again. The people who are keeping the regime in power are the opposition, who had the opportunity to implement reforms. They did not. At least last 24 years, including the 5 during the GNU. They are the ones who have been participating in these flawed elections to give ZANU-PF legitimacy. Chamisa last year lied about plugging the vote-rigging loopholes to entice, to con people into participating in flawed elections. if you are saying the people who are keeping the regime in office, well, if you're referring to the opposition, then yes, I agree with you. And here is somebody saying, oh, you must be as Arno. Well, I think, well, it's Temba again. And in this particular case, I think that has got to be dismissed as the usual mentality where if you cannot, if you disagree with anybody, you must be a ZANU-PF supporter. And if he criticizes and you're a ZANU-PF supporter, he must be a puppet of the West. I think that is a typical mentality that has not helped advance debate in Zimbabwe. How anyone can say that I am a ZANU-PF supporter when I've been calling for free, fair, and credible elections? Since when has ZANU-PF ever supported free, fair, and credible elections? I'll just close by going back to what I was talking about earlier on. If we want to recover, have any meaningful economic recovery, we really have to work on improving our democracy index. In this particular case, the one sure way of doing it is implementing the democratic reforms so that we've got free, fair, and credible elections. One of the foundations of Greece, ancient Greek, was that they did have a healthy political system in which all the citizens had a meaningful say in the governance of the country. The idea of a government of the people, for the people, by the people was born. We don't. What we have in Zimbabwe, what Mugabe created, was a political system which was meant to serve him, where those around him were bribed so that they became yes men. And even those who had some brains, they were in the cabinet for the sake of window dressing more than anything else. One can see that even today. The likes of Professor Mtholi Ncube, I think he's an intelligent individual who, if he really was allowed to function, to show his competence, I don't think he'll be selling some of the economic ideas that he's been pursuing ever since his appointment. But we know that with a regime like ZANU-PF, you're paid to praise the leader or follow him blindly. And that's what he has been doing. I remember he was asked in 2018 whether he thought the elections that year were free, fair, and credible. This was a few months after he'd been appointed Minister of Finance. And instead of answering the question directly, he said, well, the Constitutional Court confirmed that ZANU-PF was the winner. Of course, it's laughable, considering that the same Constitutional Court had just declared the 2017 military coup, legal, justifiable, and in accordance with the Constitution, according to Judge George Wesher. Of course, he didn't dare quote which section of the Constitution justified a military coup. He couldn't, because there was no section of the Constitution that justified it. And here is a minister saying later on he believes what the Constitutional Court said. The same judiciary. It's pathetic. Kumbi is saying if you are blaming Chamisa, you don't know what is going on in Zimbabwe. Well, I am blaming Chamisa for what he did. I think even you cannot deny that Chamisa lied last year when he said it plugged all the vote-taking loopholes. And I hope we're not going to argue about that. That is a historic fact. Neither are you going to argue that MDC, Chamisa and his MDC friends failed to implement even one token reform during the GNU, because that too is a historic fact. Why did they fail to implement even one token reform? They were bribed by Mugabe. It's as simple as that. I think one of the problems we have in Zimbabwe is denying historic facts. So our discourse sometimes is just meaningless. If we're going to have a meaningful discussion, we need to accept historic facts. If we're going to argue about MDC failing to implement reforms, one is going to wonder really, where are we starting here? Because that is a historic fact. Chamisa lying last year that he had plugged the vote-taking loopholes, that is a historic fact. And it's not a question of me blaming him. It's me just stating the facts as they stand. Thank you very much for listening. And I was hoping to make it 30 minutes, but just a little bit over that. And hope we'll see you again sometime. Have a nice day.